Hello and welcome to Relatable Code. In this video, we're going to talk about the constraint layout in Android. So let's get started. We have already worked with the constraint layout, but we don't know how the constraint layout itself works. Okay, so in this screen, in the activity underscore main.xml file, find the button called Clear All Constraints and click on that button. Okay, delete all constraints, click on Yes, and now run your application again. And as you can see in the emulator, the views are not positioned properly. Okay, it's as if they are all positioned at the top left of your screen. And that's the case. Okay, if you navigate here to the component tree, if you don't have it open, you have to click on this tab right here. Click on that tab, click on this button, it will be our text button, and click on this exclamation mark right here. If you expand it, you can actually read the error message here. The error message says, this view is not constrained. It only has design time positions, so it will jump to 00 at runtime unless you add the constraints. And that's exactly what happened because this point at the top left is 00. Okay, that's 0 for x and 0 for y, for your x-axis and your y-axis. Okay, so how do we solve that? We solve that by giving this view some constraints. So our constraint layout view group actually works with our views by constraining them so that it can control the position of these views at runtime, okay? Which is after you run your application. So how can we do that? In the previous video, we used this button, which is called Infer Constraints, okay? And this button, for this case, works, but as you saw, for example, for the custom text, sometimes it produces behaviors that you don't actually need, okay? And if you intend on using that button, you have to make a few modifications after that, which is why I don't use it very often, okay? But if I run my application again, you will see that our views are now properly positioned. And that's because our views now have constraints. If you notice, this button, for example, has 4 sides to it. Each side has a circle in the middle. Okay, that circle is the point that the constraint layout uses to constrain this button or this text, for example. It also has 4 sides, each side having a circle like that. Okay, same thing goes for our hello world text and our button right here. Okay, so how does the constraint layout use these circles to position these views together? Well, the constraint layout needs to have at least one of these vertical circles and one of these horizontal circles. Okay, if I go on and delete the bottom circle right here and the circle at the right, as you can see, I don't have any errors here at the left because I still have a reference to the left circle and the top circle with respect to the constraint layout. And that's enough so that I can position this in my screen, okay? But let's say I deleted this top circle constraint right there. As you can see, I now have an error. If I expand that error, you can see this view is not constrained vertically. At runtime, it will jump to the top unless you add a vertical constraint. Okay, so when you work with the constraint layout, which is the most popular layout in Android at the moment, you have to pay attention to that. You have to make sure that your views are constrained at least with one circle vertically and one circle horizontally. Okay, and what do I mean by constraint? For example, this huge button right here actually has something that says that the top of this button has a reference to the top of the screen itself. Okay, and the start or the left of this button has a reference to the left of our screen. Okay, same thing goes for the right circle right here. This is a right constraint to the end of the button, and it is a constraint between the bottom, and the right of the screen. Well, what about the bottom circle right here? This bottom circle represents a constraint between the bottom of this button and the top of this text view. Okay, this actually says that this button is positioned like that. It needs to know the screen to the left and to the right, and the top of the screen, and in addition, the top of this text view, so that it can position this button properly. Okay, and with respect to custom text, it's positioned like that. So the left constraint of this text view is positioned to the left of the screen. The bottom constraint is positioned or has a reference to the bottom of the screen right there. And with respect to the top of this text, it's positioned to the bottom of this button. Okay, so after this button is situated in my screen, this text view will have a reference to the bottom of that button. Okay, the same thing goes for our Hello World text view. It has three constraints, as you can see. The top of this text view has a reference to the bottom of our text button, and the right of this text view is holding a reference to this button, as is our bottom constraint right here. Okay, so as you can see, you have a lot of flexibility with using constraint layouts. You can have constraints to any of the four sides of any view you want, and you can position it to the screen itself or any other view if you want that. Okay, and just like that, our constraint layout now has an idea of how to organize the views inside the screen. Okay, as we've discussed, it needs at least one horizontal reference of every view and one vertical reference. So I can delete the left reference here for this button and the bottom reference right there, and I still don't have any error. If I delete the right reference right here, I no longer have a horizontal reference for this button, and that's why I now get an error. Okay, so make sure that you really understand how these constraints work so that you can make basically any UI that you have in mind. Okay, and besides that, what else do you need to know about constraint layouts? You can actually have a property that lets the width of this button, for example, fill out its horizontal constraints. And what I mean by that is, for example, this button is situated to the left of the screen and to the right of the screen. There's a property that you can use to have this button fill out the full width of those constraints. And you can access that with the attributes window here at the right. If you don't have this attributes window, you have to click on this tab right here. And with this button, you have to click on that. You can scroll down to layout width and click on that drop down menu. Okay, here you can see you have an option called 0dp. If you click on that option, our button now occupies the full width of that screen, and that's because it's positioned to the left of the screen and to the right of that screen. So the 0dp option right here lets the button stretch to fill out those constraints. Okay, if I use the same setting for the vertical settings of that button, that's also 0dp, but for some reason the button doesn't stretch vertically, you might ask. That's because this button has a top margin and a bottom margin. Okay, and you can see them right here. So it has a top margin of 69 dp, which pushes this button 69 dp from the top of the screen, and it has a bottom margin of 160 dp right there, which pushes it 160 dp from the top of this text view. If I make those to be 0, both of them, as you can see, our button now stretches to fill out the full height of those constraints. Okay, let's click on Control Z. That's a really ugly button. Okay, that's more I like it. You need to know how to use this 0DP because we're going to use it a lot. Okay. And you can delete any constraint that you want from any view using the control left click. Okay. So if I delete the bottom constraint right here, as you can see, it's no longer stretching out the bottom. I can now drag it however I want with respect to this custom text view. Okay, I can give it any height I want and I can drag it however I want. And you have several properties if you want with respect to the height and the width of this view. You have, for example, if I expand on the height, you have 0dp, you have the wrap content option, which basically says that this button should only occupy the height that it needs. So if I have a larger text size for the text of this button, let's expand this and let's give it a 20 SP size. And as you can see, the text view expanded to contain this text now, just because we used the wrap content for our height. If we had used something like a static height, like 20dp for example, as you can see, sometimes it cuts off the text of that view. And that's because 20dp is not large enough to fit this text right here, which is why we used wrap content. Okay, so you have wrap content, you have 0dp, just like we saw, which lets this view occupy the height or the width that it needs according to its constraints. And you also have a third option actually. Let's explore that with the width of this text view right here. You can write match parent. Okay, click on enter. And now this text will expand to fill the full width of the screen. Okay, it didn't fill out the full width from the left because it had a left margin of 44 dp. If that becomes 0, now this text fills the full width of that screen. And the difference between 0dp and match parent is 0dp actually takes into account the constraints of this view. So if it has a top constraint to the bottom of this button and a bottom constraint like that, I can give it a height of 0dp and delete the top margin in addition to the bottom margin. And here it fills this height just as much as it needs for its constraints, okay, which stretches it out like that. But if this height was match parent, as you can see, it now has the full height of the whole screen, okay. That's not very apparent with the text view because it's a text view with a white background like that. Let's try it out with our button. And here you can see that the button almost filled the full height of that screen. And due to its margins, it didn't fill out the entire height. But if those margins become 0, now this button has the whole height of that screen because of the match parent property. Okay, and that's the difference between using match parent, 0dp, and wrap content. Okay, and now we're going to talk about these options at the top. Okay, let's start with the left option, which is view options. This lets you toggle what you see here with this constraint layout. If you click on show system UI, for example, you can now see that top status bar and this bottom bar right here, okay, on an Android phone. So now you can actually toggle your UI in accordance with these bars, okay? And you can toggle any option depending on what you want to see in that screen, okay? The two most common options that I use are show margins and show system UI, okay? And that's with respect to the view options. What about the disable auto connection to parent. It's toggled off by default, I believe. And I'll show you what it does. If you toggle it and you add, for example, let's add a button. If you situate this button at the middle of the screen, it gets created with a left and a right constraint like that. Okay. If I move this up a little bit and I move this button to the left, you can see that it now has a top and a bottom constraint as well. Okay. If you disable that option and you add that button to the center of the screen, as you can see, you no longer have that option. Okay. So enable that if you feel like it's something that you need. And for the third option, you have default margins. By default, it's 0 dp, and I'll show you how these work. If I add a new button to the screen and I add a left constraint, as you can see, it sticks to the left of the screen. And that's because it now has a margin of 0 dp. If I delete that button and I create a default margin of 24 dp, if I now add another button and I constrain it to the left of my screen, as you can see, by default, it has a left constraint or a left margin of 24 dp. And if I add a top constraint to this button, that top constraint is also 24 dp by default. Okay, and that's the third option right here. For the fourth option, we already used it. It deletes all of the constraints in this UI in case you want to start over. The fifth option gives constraints to every view in this UI. We also used that. And with respect to these two options right here, I don't use them a lot actually. But for example, this pack, if you click on expand horizontally, as you can see, the button just stretches out like that. For expand vertically, it also stretches out vertically. But I don't use them because I would rather actually make these constraints manually. Okay, you will rarely need to use that. And with respect to the align option, you can click on that and you can click on horizontally, for example. And now this button is positioned horizontally in the screen. If I make that 0 dp, it's now perfectly positioned horizontally. Okay, and if you click on vertically, it also jumps down vertically. It has a top constraint to the bottom of this button and a bottom constraint to the top of this text view. Okay, as you can see here, if I click on this and I have it at 0 dp, you can also see it positioned exactly in the middle of these constraints. Okay, when you're working with constraint layouts in Android, it's a good idea to think from top to bottom. Okay, so for example, let's clear out all our constraints again. Let's move these a little further down. What I mean by top to bottom is you check what's the top view that you need in your hierarchy, and you give it the constraints. For example, I want to give it the left and right constraints, and I have to position it vertically as well. I don't recommend using bottom constraints for views that are below it. Instead, when you want to achieve that behavior, go to the view that's below this button and give it a top constraint to that button. Okay, this will save you from a lot of inconsistencies in the UI. That's what I use at least. Same thing goes for this button, for example. Let's constrain it to the right and constrain its top to the bottom of this custom text. And you can do that for all of the views. This button is below that one, so let's have the top of this button to the bottom of that one with respect to the constraints. And with respect to the last text view, you can position it with respect to that button. Let's use the horizontal alignment, and now I have a nice hierarchy from top to bottom. This view only knows of the top. Same thing goes for this one and all of the other views in this hierarchy. Okay? If you find my type of content to be relatable, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for future content, and I'll see you in the next video.